welcome you gently, the way I would if you were sitting across from me with a warm cup in your hands. And if you are new here, I hope you can like and subscribe so you stay close as I share this part of my life that has lived quietly in my memory for decades. At 60, I speak with a softer heart than the one I carried in my younger years. And when I look back, the moments that once felt heavy now return as calm reminders of who I became through them. I grew up poor enough that my hands learned work before comfort. And when I entered the world of the man I loved, a world filled with wealth that could swallow a person whole if they were not prepared, I did not yet understand the price of stepping into a life so far from my own. His parents made their thoughts known without raising a voice. Their eyes were enough to remind me that I was not welcome, not suitable, not shaped for their son's world. Still, love has a way of pushing forward even when the ground is uneven. And I held onto the belief that what he and I felt would be stronger than the quiet walls they built around us. But the truth is that love can be shaken easily when every room whispers that you are out of place. And I soon learned how small and exposed a person can feel when surrounded by luxury that wasn't made for them. I will not rush ahead, because this story unfolds slowly, in the same way life unfolded for me, one quiet cut at a time. And the part where everything changes, the part where the same family who pushed me aside eventually needed me more than they ever imagined, comes later. For now, I need to take you back to the earliest days, because that is where the wounds began. And even now, all these years later, I still feel the echo of how those wounds were first made. In those early days of my marriage, I walked through that grand house with careful steps, reminding myself to breathe slowly, so I would not let the silence swallow me whole. Because silence in a wealthy home feels different from silence in a poor one. In poverty, silence is rest, but in wealth, silence can feel like judgment. Every morning, I woke before the sun, the way I always had growing up, and though no one asked me to, I would straighten small things around the kitchen or fold stray linens, because doing so anchored me in a place that constantly reminded me I did not belong. My husband tried to shield me from his family's stares, but even he could not soften the way his mother watched me, as if I were a stain on the edges of her perfect life. She rarely spoke to me directly, choosing instead to let her disapproval float around the room in half-finished sentences and raised eyebrows. And though I told myself her opinions did not matter, I felt them tightening around my chest with each passing day. His father was quieter, but his quietness was not kindness. It was a dismissal so cold that I sometimes wished he would simply tell me to leave rather than look through me, as though I were a shadow passing across his expensive floors. I tried to remind myself that love had carried me into this home, that my husband had chosen me with sincerity. But the weight of being constantly measured, my past, my clothes, my habits, my very presence, made me shrink inside myself, until even my laughter felt like something I needed permission to release. Yet, in the middle of that tension, I found small pockets of peace, like the quiet mornings when my husband and I shared simple breakfasts away from the eyes of his parents, or the evenings when he held my hand just a little tighter, as if he sensed how hard I was fighting to stay steady. But even then, I could feel something shifting beneath the surface, a tension growing in his family that had nothing to do with me, something unspoken that made their walls feel less like barriers and more like warnings. And I sensed, without fully understanding, that whatever was brewing in their world would eventually reach me, even if I tried to keep my head down and my heart steady. I just didn't know that the first crack in their perfect image would appear far sooner than any of us expected. The first crack appeared on a quiet afternoon when the house felt unusually tense, the kind of tension that settles into the walls before anyone speaks a word. And even though I had learned to move softly through that home, I could feel something was different the moment I stepped into the hallway. My mother-in-law, usually composed and polished like a woman carved from cold marble, was pacing the sitting room with a phone pressed to her ear, her voice low but sharp, carrying an edge I had never heard from her before. My father-in-law sat stiffly in his armchair, his jaw tightened, his hands clasped as though he were holding something inside that might break free if he loosened his grip even slightly. I paused at the doorway, unsure if I should give them space or pretend I saw nothing. But before I could decide, my husband appeared from the study and gave me a quick look that told me everything without explaining anything. Something was truly wrong, and whatever it was bigger than the silent battles they waged against me. I stood there, my hands lightly brushing the fabric of my dress, trying to steady myself, because being poor teaches you to read a room long before you open your mouth. And in that moment, the room told me this family was hiding a problem that money alone couldn't smooth over. My mother-in-law ended her call abruptly, her face pale beneath all that elegance, and when her eyes met mine, there was something unfamiliar in them, not anger, not disdain, but a flicker of worry she couldn't mask quickly enough. She looked away, as though she regretted letting me witness even that small crack in her perfect posture. My husband walked toward me, his voice gentle but strained as he suggested we take a walk outside. And I understood that he needed distance from whatever storm was forming behind those walls. As we stepped into the garden, he held my hand tighter than usual, and though he didn't yet share the details, I could feel the weight of it pressing through his fingers. For the first time, I sensed that their world, the one so solid, wealthy, immaculate, was not as unshakable as they wanted everyone to believe. And as we walked beneath the fading afternoon light, I had no idea that the storm growing inside that house would soon pull me into its center, whether they wanted my presence or not. We walked the length of the garden in silence for a while, my husband rubbing his thumb over the back of my hand, the way he always did when something weighed heavily on him. And I waited with patience, because I had learned that forcing words out of someone only makes them hide their truth deeper. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but thin, as if he were trying to hold together pieces of himself that had already begun to slip. He told me his father had been receiving quiet warnings for months about a business deal that was unraveling, something they kept hidden not only from the public, but from the extended family, because pride ran thicker than honesty in that house. The deal had been built on partnerships that were now collapsing, and the partners were threatening to take legal action that would stain his father's name in ways no amount of money could fully clean. I listened, letting the details settle one by one, realizing how much they had concealed behind their polished faces and their strict standards. It struck me that a family so quick to judge my background had been fighting their own battles in silence, pretending their world was untouchable, while I quietly tried to survive inside it. My husband explained that the tension I had noticed was only the beginning, that the investors were demanding immediate meetings, and that one wrong step could cost his father everything he had built over a lifetime. He looked at me then, his eyes gentle but tired, and though he didn't say it outright, I could sense the fear beneath his calm tone, the fear of watching his family lose the wealth that had shaped their identity for generations. I felt no satisfaction, no sense of triumph in hearing that the people who had looked down on me were now facing their own hardship. Instead, I felt a strange ache, the kind that comes when you realize pain doesn't discriminate between rich or poor. It finds anyone who believes they're immune. As the wind moved through the trees, brushing leaves across the path like scattered memories, I felt a shift within myself too, a quiet understanding that their world, no matter how tightly guarded, was beginning to bend under pressure, and I didn't yet know that this pressure would soon twist their lives in a way that would force them to look at me differently, whether they were ready to or not. The next few days moved slowly, each one carrying a heaviness that settled into every corner of the house, as though even the furniture knew the balance of their world was shifting. My mother-in-law grew quieter, which surprised me, because silence had always been her weapon. But now, it felt more like something she used to shield herself rather than wound others. She watched her husband closely, following him from room to room with a controlled worry she tried to hide beneath polite conversations and perfectly arranged table settings. My father-in-law spent most of his time in the study. The door cracked open just enough for voices to spill through: lawyers, partners, advisors, all speaking in low tones that made the future sound uncertain. I moved through the house with the same careful steps I had always taken, but now there was no denying the energy had changed. The grandeur of the home felt brittle, like glass waiting for the wrong vibration to shatter it. My husband did his best to keep my presence shielded from their growing tension, and though he never said it aloud, I could feel he needed my calm more than ever. I found myself making small gestures, brewing tea for his parents, organizing the kitchen, leaving the living room neat, simple habits from my upbringing that steadied me, and strangely, steadied them too. One afternoon, when I placed a tray of tea on the table, my mother-in-law paused, her eyes lingering on me with an expression I had never seen from her. It wasn't warmth, not yet, but it wasn't the cold dismissal I had grown used to either. It was something in between, something uncertain. She didn't thank me, but she also didn't look away. And in that quiet moment, I understood that even people who build walls around themselves can feel overwhelmed when those walls begin to tremble. Still, I didn't step closer. I knew better than to push a boundary before its time. I simply offered a small nod, the kind that respects distance but acknowledges humanity. She held my gaze for a breath longer than usual before returning her attention to the papers spread across the table. That moment stayed with me, not because it was tender, but because it was the first sign that the roles in this house were shifting, not by intention, but by necessity. What I didn't know then was that the shift would soon become a turning point, one that would pull me into their struggles in a way none of us could ignore. The turning point began on an evening that should have been ordinary, the kind of evening where the house usually settled into its usual routine. My father-in-law reading stiffly in his armchair, my mother-in-law arranging her thoughts behind that strict composure of hers, and my husband and I finding quiet refuge in our room. But that night, the air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were bracing for impact. I was folding laundry when I heard raised voices coming from the study, not loud enough to be called a fight, but sharp enough to cut through the hallway. My husband stepped out before I could move closer, closing the door behind him with a heaviness that told me the news inside was far worse than anything he had shared before. He walked toward me slowly, his expression tight with worry, and though he tried to steady his breathing, his eyes gave away more than his words ever could. He explained that the business deal had deteriorated further, that the partners had gathered evidence strong enough to tarnish his father's reputation publicly, and that papers were already being prepared, papers that would drag the family name into a scandal they had never imagined possible. The fear behind his calm voice reminded me of the fear I used to see in neighbors' faces back in the poor community where I grew up, fear of losing something essential, something that held a life together. But in this house, the fear was wrapped in pride, making it harder for them to admit how fragile their world had become. My husband said his mother was refusing to accept the severity of the situation, insisting that their long-standing status would protect them, while his father, usually stoic, had begun to show cracks beneath the pressure. I listened carefully, absorbing every detail, not because I knew the world of wealth or business, but because I knew what it felt like to stand on unstable ground, unsure which way the world would tilt next. And as I stood in that hallway with him, I realized something deeper. This family, who had always treated me as though I were beneath them, was now facing a fear I understood more than they ever had. That understanding didn't give me power or satisfaction. Instead, it gave me a strange sense of responsibility, though I didn't yet know why. My husband leaned against the wall, letting out a long breath he had been holding in for days, and I placed my hand on his arm, offering the quiet strength I had built over a lifetime of surviving uncertainty. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if my touch reminded him he wasn't alone. And in that long, quiet moment between us, I felt something shift, not in the house, but in the path life was preparing for me. I didn't know it yet, but their downfall was about to pull me forward in a way that would change the way they saw me forever. The following morning, the house felt heavier than ever, as if the walls themselves were burdened with the weight of secrets and unspoken fears. And even the sunlight struggling through the tall windows seemed dimmed by the tension that had settled so firmly into every room. My mother-in-law moved with a rigid precision, arranging flowers on the dining table, adjusting curtains, and straightening cushions with a sharpness that betrayed the storm inside her mind, while my father-in-law spent long stretches in the study, shuffling papers and making calls with a quiet urgency that betrayed a man used to control, but now facing chaos. I went about my day performing the small, careful rituals that had become my way of maintaining balance, preparing tea, folding clothes, tending to minor details around the home. But this time, every gesture felt heavier because I sensed their need, unspoken yet undeniable, for someone steady to lean on. My husband stayed close, hovering between the chaos of his parents' world and the quiet refuge of our shared space. And in his eyes, I saw exhaustion tempered by a flicker of trust, a silent acknowledgement that I could bear the weight of their unfolding troubles without crumbling. It struck me, quietly but profoundly, that life has a way of turning tables in the most unexpected ways. The same family who had once looked at me with quiet disdain, convinced of my insufficiency, was now facing challenges that left them exposed and uncertain. And without realizing it, they were beginning to see me differently. I did not rush to take control, nor did I announce my presence with pride. I simply remained steady, a calm point in the storm, offering small acts of care that cost me nothing, but carried immense weight in a house desperate for composure. That evening, as I carried a tray of tea into the sitting room, my mother-in-law paused in her meticulous arrangements, her hands faltering for the first time I had ever seen. And for a brief, almost imperceptible moment, she looked at me with something that resembled recognition, though it was buried beneath layers of pride and disbelief. I met her gaze, holding it just long enough to acknowledge the silent shift, and without a word, I understood that life had begun rewriting the rules of this house, quietly and without ceremony. I did not yet know the full extent of what was coming, but the first signs were clear. The world they had once used to judge me was bending, and soon they would have no choice but to rely on the one person they had underestimated the most. In the days that followed, the household seemed suspended in a strange state of anticipation, like a quiet storm waiting for the first drop of rain. And I moved through it with the care of someone who knows the fragility of both people and pride. My mother-in-law's glances grew less sharp, though she still maintained the polished exterior that had been her shield for decades, while my father-in-law's silence deepened, as if the weight of responsibility had begun to press him into himself, leaving him a man who no longer seemed entirely certain of his own strength. I watched my husband navigate between them with a patience I had only ever admired from afar. The tension in his shoulders, a reminder that even love could not dissolve the pressures they were facing. I continued my small acts of steadiness, bringing tea at just the right moment, adjusting chairs, folding linens, and offering a quiet presence that required no explanation. Because I had learned early in life that in times of uncertainty, small gestures can carry more influence than any argument or confrontation. The irony was not lost on me. The family that had once measured me by the poverty of my upbringing was now leaning, ever so slightly, on the person they had dismissed. needing the very composure and patience they had assumed I lacked. One afternoon, I caught my mother-in-law in the hallway, hesitating mid-step, as if she had intended to speak, but wasn't sure whether her words would admit weakness or seek help. Her eyes met mine for a fraction longer than usual, and I offered a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement that I understood without prying. In that brief connection, I sensed a crack in the armor she had maintained for so long, a crack that was neither triumph nor vindication for me, but rather a quiet turning of fate's page, one that neither of us could yet read fully. My husband, sensing the subtle shift, took my hand that evening as we walked through the garden, and I felt the weight of unspoken worries that we would face together. And as the sky darkened and the wind carried the scent of rain, I realized that the next steps in their world, and in mine, would test patience, courage, and the quiet strength I had cultivated all my life. Little did I know that soon, the very people who had dismissed me would find themselves needing my guidance in ways none of us could have imagined. As the tension in the house grew, I began to notice small, almost imperceptible shifts in how they interacted with me, gestures that were not yet kind, but no longer strictly cold, as if they were testing the waters of a new reality in which I mattered in ways they had never expected. My mother-in-law, who had always kept a watchful eye to detect any sign of weakness, started lingering near the kitchen when I moved about, not to supervise, but perhaps to observe quietly how I carried myself, how calmly I responded to the weight pressing down on all of us. My father-in-law's once impenetrable composure was fraying in subtle ways. A sigh slipped past his lips when he thought no one was watching. His shoulders slumped slightly after tense phone calls, and I felt a mixture of empathy and quiet understanding for the man who had once looked at me as though I were beneath him. My husband continued to be my anchor, offering comfort with his presence and small words of reassurance that reminded me love can exist even when life shakes the very ground beneath you. I moved through the home carefully, attentive to the emotions that swirled invisibly around me, performing acts of steadiness, preparing meals, arranging the living spaces, quietly offering comfort where it was needed without needing acknowledgement, because I had learned long ago that calm persistence often speaks louder than words. One afternoon, my mother-in-law hesitated at the doorway to the study, a stack of documents in her hands, and for the first time, she asked for my opinion on a matter she clearly hadn't wanted to share with anyone else. A simple question that carried a weight I had never been invited to hold before. I answered with quiet clarity, offering solutions that were rooted in experience and patience, not pride. And I saw her tighten her grip on the papers, as though my words had unsettled something she had taken for granted. My father-in-law, overhearing the exchange, paused in his chair, and in that moment, I realized the dynamic of the house was beginning to change, subtly, imperceptibly, but irrevocably. The people who had once assumed my presence was negligible were now facing a reality in which I had become a quiet source of guidance. And though the full consequences of this shift had not yet revealed themselves, I could sense that the coming days would challenge all of us in ways that would leave no one untouched. And I did not yet know that the decisions we made together in these quiet moments would determine the fate of the family they had built, and the respect they had long denied me. The days that followed brought an unfamiliar rhythm to the house, one that hummed quietly beneath the usual routines, but carried a tension that seemed to touch every corner, every polished surface, and every carefully constructed smile. My husband and I walked through it together, silently acknowledging that life had shifted in ways neither of us could have predicted. And I noticed the subtle changes in his parents, as if the cracks in their carefully maintained world were becoming more visible with each passing hour. My mother-in-law, once sharp and almost intimidating in her observation of every detail, now hesitated in her movements, occasionally pausing to glance at me with a fleeting expression that I couldn't fully interpret. Was it acknowledgement, curiosity, or the first stirrings of respect? My father-in-law, usually rigid and commanding, had begun to seek advice in private moments. Small questions about procedures and choices that he would never have asked when he believed himself invulnerable. I carried on my routines with quiet care, preparing meals, arranging spaces, and offering calm without commentary, knowing that my steadiness had begun to fill a gap they hadn't realized existed. And yet, the most telling sign came one evening when a tense meeting with a business associate ended abruptly, and my mother-in-law retreated into the sitting room with a stack of papers, asking me, almost hesitantly, to review them before she presented them to her husband. The request was simple, but it carried an immense weight. She had chosen to include me in matters she would have previously considered far beyond my station. And in that moment, I understood that life was subtly rewriting the hierarchy they had always enforced. My husband squeezed my hand, a silent reassurance that he, too, saw what was happening. And I felt a quiet satisfaction, not rooted in pride or revenge, but in knowing that my patience, my composure, and the way I had carried myself had earned me a space they could no longer ignore. Still, there was a lingering uncertainty in the air, a sense that this newfound acknowledgement came at a cost none of us could yet see. And I realized that the real test of strength, of trust, and of the fragile respect I had begun to earn was still unfolding, quietly but insistently. And in the quiet of that evening, I felt the first true stirrings of change, a prelude to challenges and revelations that would test us all in ways we could never have anticipated. As the household adjusted to this subtle shift, I began to notice that the atmosphere, though still tense, carried a quiet openness I had never seen before. Small moments of vulnerability appeared in places where once there had been only pride and judgment. My mother-in-law, who had once wielded her authority like a weapon, now lingered near me during daily routines, occasionally asking for my thoughts on matters I had never been invited to consider before. And though her questions were cautious, I recognized the tentative trust behind them. My father-in-law, too, had started to rely on me in ways that were not verbalized, but clearly present. He would watch me handle small household problems with composure, sometimes stepping back as though testing my judgment. And the nods he offered in those moments carried more acknowledgement than any words could. My husband observed these changes quietly, his hand often finding mine when we walked through the hallways, or tended to the minor disruptions that seemed to grow daily. And I felt the weight of both responsibility and quiet satisfaction settle over me. Responsibility, because the family's respect was fragile and conditional, and satisfaction, because the patience and humility I had carried all these years were finally seen as strengths rather than weaknesses. Yet, even as the family began to lean on me, the underlying tension from the failing business deal and the looming public exposure remained a persistent shadow over every interaction. I noticed subtle exchanges, glances of uncertainty, brief hesitations in conversations, a pause in the usual critiques. They all hinted at the silent fear that their carefully constructed world could crumble entirely without someone to guide them. I maintained my calm, offering discreet support where I could, because I had learned that influence is rarely claimed by force. It is earned quietly, persistently, and often invisibly. That evening, as I carried a tray of tea into the study where my father-in-law was reviewing documents, he looked up at me, eyes briefly meeting mine, and for a fleeting moment, there was no arrogance, no superiority, only acknowledgement of the steadiness I had provided, and the unspoken understanding that the house had begun to depend on me. And in that brief connection, I sensed that the real test of their trust and of my role in this family was only just beginning. The days grew heavier. Yet, in the quiet routines of the house, I noticed a subtle transformation taking place, one that neither my husband nor I could have predicted, but which became impossible to ignore. My mother-in-law began seeking my input on decisions small and large, testing my judgment on matters she would never have considered involving me before. And though her questions were cautious and carefully measured, I could sense a growing reliance, an unspoken acknowledgement that I had become a quiet anchor in the storm of their lives. My father-in-law, once so rigid and unyielding, started to show cracks in his composure, letting moments of hesitation slip through during tense discussions with advisors and business partners. Moments where he would glance at me for reassurance, or simply pause, as if knowing that my steady presence could help him navigate decisions that had begun to overwhelm him. Even my husband, who had always shielded me from his family's scrutiny, began to trust in my ability to understand the subtle dynamics, quietly observing the exchanges and allowing me to act where he could not intervene. I continued my careful routines, not seeking recognition, simply offering calm, small gestures that carried more weight than I think they ever realized. Arranging spaces, preparing meals, handling minor household tasks, all with the patience and poise cultivated from a lifetime of understanding hardship. There were moments when I caught a glance from my mother-in-law that lingered a fraction too long, a silent acknowledgement of the shift in power, or perhaps of the reality that she now depended on someone she had once dismissed. And yet, the undercurrent of uncertainty remained. Business pressures mounted, deadlines loomed, and every conversation carried the quiet tension of stakes that could not be ignored. I knew that the family's fragile dependence on me was only growing, And though it was not openly admitted, it was undeniable in every careful glance, every hesitant question, every unspoken pause. By the end of that week, it was clear to me that the family's respect and reliance were shifting irreversibly, and the next steps would demand a delicate balance between patience, wisdom, and courage. One misstep could unravel all that was being quietly rebuilt. The following morning brought a new layer of tension, but also a subtle, almost imperceptible sense of alignment that had not existed before, as if the house itself was adjusting to the reality that I had become more than just the wife they once dismissed. I had become someone whose presence could stabilize the fragile equilibrium they had so long taken for granted. My mother-in-law, though still reserved and meticulous, began to linger near me in moments where she previously would have kept her distance, asking questions in hushed tones about details she assumed I might overlook, but which I responded to with quiet precision, demonstrating a competence she could not ignore. My father-in-law, whose pride had always been formidable, started consulting me in private, presenting small dilemmas and observing my reactions. And in those moments, I sensed a shift in his perception, an acknowledgement that the skills and calm I brought were now quietly essential to the household's functioning. My husband continued to move between us, aware of the tension, but also keenly aware of how our partnership provided a steadiness that neither of us could have fully predicted. And I felt the weight of both responsibility and quiet satisfaction settling into me as I navigated this new dynamic. Even as I carried out my small acts of care, preparing meals, organizing spaces, offering calm guidance, the larger pressures of the crumbling business deal loomed, a constant reminder that respect and reliance, while growing, existed within a landscape still marked by fear and uncertainty. One afternoon, my mother-in-law handed me a set of documents she had been reviewing alone, asking me to help prepare a response she intended to present to her husband. The request was simple in words, but heavy with meaning, a clear indication that she now saw me as a trusted presence in matters that mattered to her most. I accepted the responsibility quietly, aware that my role had expanded beyond what anyone in that house had anticipated. And yet, I also understood that this new trust was delicate and could shift with the wrong move. That evening, as I walked through the garden with my husband, I reflected on how much had changed and how subtly power and respect had begun to realign in our favor. And I realized that the coming days would demand every ounce of patience and composure I had cultivated in my life. And I knew deep down that this slow transformation was only the beginning of a journey that would reshape the family entirely, for better or worse. By the middle of that week, the household had settled into a rhythm that was both tense and cautious, a strange balance between old hierarchies and the subtle new influence I held. And I moved through it aware of how much had changed and how much still remained unspoken. My mother-in-law, who had once scrutinized me with a sharp eye for imperfections, now included me in decisions that mattered to her, often pausing to consider my input before committing to her own. And while she still maintained her polished composure, I could feel the quiet respect growing in the pauses and the careful glances she offered. My father-in-law, once unyielding in his pride, occasionally sought my counsel on matters that had previously been entirely beyond my reach. And each time he did, I sensed a mixture of hesitancy and realization, a recognition that I possessed a steadiness and insight that he had underestimated for too long. My husband remained my anchor, walking beside me through these subtle shifts, offering reassurance in quiet touches and whispered words, reminding me that love is most steadfast when it weathers uncertainty without demanding acknowledgement. I continued my small, deliberate gestures of care, arranging the living spaces, preparing meals, smoothing over minor tensions, all actions that cost nothing materially, but seemed to carry immense weight in the fragile equilibrium of the house. The underlying stress of the failing business deal persisted, like a low hum beneath every conversation, every interaction. But for the first time, I sensed that the family's reliance on me had become a stabilizing force rather than a temporary convenience. One evening, as I handed my mother-in-law a carefully prepared set of documents for her review, I noticed the subtle way she paused, the faintest sigh escaping her lips, as if silently acknowledging that my role had become indispensable. A realization she could not yet fully admit out loud. I accepted the moment quietly, aware that respect earned through patience and humility is far more enduring than that demanded through power or fear. And yet, even as I navigated this growing influence, I could feel the tension building toward a moment of reckoning, one that would test the delicate trust that had been quietly established and reveal the true measure of who we were in the face of crisis. I knew that soon the household would be forced to confront truths it had long ignored, and my presence in that confrontation would be undeniable. The days that followed felt like walking on a thin thread, where every gesture, every word, carried weight far beyond what it appeared to hold, and I moved carefully, aware that the household was watching, learning, and adjusting to my presence in ways they could not fully articulate. My mother-in-law, still maintaining her elegance and composure, began seeking my guidance on matters that required patience and tact, the kind of small decisions that could ripple outward into larger consequences. And I noticed a subtle change in the way she regarded me, not with dismissal or suspicion, but with a cautious curiosity that bordered on respect. My father-in-law, whose pride had always been formidable, showed faint signs of reliance, consulting me privately and observing my approach to challenges, silently acknowledging that the calm and steadiness I carried were qualities he had once assumed I lacked. My husband, sensing the delicate shifts in the household, remained my steadfast companion, offering quiet support and encouragement, reminding me that love sometimes speaks loudest in silence, in shared glances and gentle touches rather than words. I continued my daily routines, preparing meals, arranging spaces, managing small household details with deliberate care, not seeking approval, but understanding that each act of composure subtly reinforced the trust I was quietly earning. The tension of the failing business deal loomed persistently, a shadow over the family's interactions. Yet, my presence seemed to absorb some of that pressure, allowing the family to navigate decisions with more clarity than they had shown before. One afternoon, my mother-in-law hesitated in the hallway, handing me a folder of documents she had been reviewing alone, her eyes meeting mine for the briefest moment, a flicker of acknowledgement passing between us, an unspoken recognition that my influence had grown in ways she could neither control nor dismiss. I accepted the responsibility calmly, knowing that patience, humility, and quiet strength had become my greatest tools. And I understood that the household was now entering a delicate phase where every choice, every reaction would determine not only the outcome of the crisis, but also the true measure of respect and trust they had begun to place in me. And as I walked through the quiet rooms that evening, I sensed that the coming days would reveal just how much this family depended on the one they had once underestimated most. The household continued to change in subtle but undeniable ways, each day layering a new understanding over the quiet dynamics that had long defined their world. And I moved through it with awareness, patience, and a sense of responsibility that grew heavier as their reliance on me became more apparent. My mother-in-law, who had once measured me against impossible standards of wealth and upbringing, now occasionally sought my opinion on decisions that affected not only the home, but also the delicate balance of the family's reputation. And I noticed the faintest flicker of respect in the careful way she listened, pausing before asserting her own viewpoint. My father-in-law, whose pride had been a wall no one could breach, was now inviting my insight into matters he previously considered beyond my station. And in those quiet moments, I realized the power of calm composure and steadfastness, qualities honed in a life of hardship that he had underestimated for too long. My husband remained my quiet support, guiding me with subtle reassurance, reminding me that patience and presence can speak louder than any words of argument. And together, we navigated the growing pressure that loomed from the collapsing business deal and the uncertainty it cast over every household interaction. I continued my routines with deliberate care, tending to the small details that steadied the home, offering guidance and calm without demanding recognition. And each gesture seemed to quietly reinforce the trust they had begun to place in me. One evening, as I helped my mother-in-law organize correspondence related to the business, I noticed a subtle shift in her demeanor. Her usual polished composure softened just enough to reveal the unspoken acknowledgement that my presence was now indispensable. A realization she neither verbalized nor fully accepted, but could not ignore. It was a reminder that respect, once earned through quiet persistence and consistent steadiness, holds a power that neither money nor status can command. And that influence can grow silently in the spaces between expectation and understanding. And as I left the room that night, I felt a sense of anticipation, knowing that the next challenge would test not only their reliance on me, but also the depth of the trust that had quietly blossomed in the midst of their crisis. The days continued to weave a delicate tension through the house, one that was both heavy with responsibility and quietly transformative, and I moved within it like someone accustomed to navigating uncertain terrain with patience and care. My mother-in-law, once quick to judge and dismiss, now sought my opinion on matters small and significant. Her questions careful, deliberate, and tinged with a newfound respect that she could neither fully admit nor deny. My father-in-law, whose pride had been formidable, began pausing before decisions, sometimes looking to me for quiet reassurance, acknowledging silently that the steadiness I brought to the household was not just comforting, but necessary. My husband, ever aware of the subtle shifts, offered his gentle support in ways that reminded me how strong partnership can be when faced with circumstances that test more than just affection, but also resilience and composure. I continued my daily acts, preparing meals, arranging the home, handling details that seemed minor, but carried weight beyond measure with deliberate care, understanding that the balance of this household increasingly rested on quiet guidance rather than authority. Yet, despite the growing acknowledgement of my role, the pressures of the failing business deal lingered, a persistent shadow over every interaction, every decision, every glance exchanged between the family members. One afternoon, my mother-in-law, pausing mid-step with a folder of correspondence in hand, looked at me with eyes that betrayed a mixture of hesitation and realization, a silent acknowledgement that the one she had once dismissed as incapable was now an essential part of the household's functioning. That brief moment carried a weight I could feel in my chest, not of triumph, but of responsibility, knowing that respect earned quietly is fragile and must be handled with care. As I walked through the corridors that evening, observing the subtle shifts in their behavior, I understood that the household was entering a critical phase, one where reliance, trust, and quiet guidance would be tested in ways that no one could fully predict. And I sensed that the decisions we made in these moments, however small they seemed, would determine the family's path and the place I now held within it. The days leading up to the critical meeting with the business partners were heavy with quiet anticipation, and the house seemed to breathe in sync with the tension that filled every room, every corridor, every glance exchanged between its occupants. My mother-in-law moved with her usual precision, yet there was a softness now in her pauses, a subtle hesitation that revealed how much she had come to rely on my judgment and calm presence in these uncertain times. My father-in-law, whose pride had always been unshakable, consulted me discreetly, presenting scenarios and asking for my perspective in ways that would have been unthinkable months before. And I felt the weight of that trust settle firmly on my shoulders, not with pride, but with the quiet responsibility of knowing their reliance was real and consequential. My husband remained my anchor, walking beside me in silence, offering reassurance with small gestures and quiet words, a reminder that in times of uncertainty, support often speaks louder than any argument. I continued my routines, tending to the home, preparing meals, and smoothing over minor tensions, knowing that the smallest acts of composure could ripple outward, creating stability in an environment that had grown fragile under the pressure of looming consequences. And then, one evening, My mother-in-law paused with a folder of correspondence, meeting my eyes with a look I had never seen before, an acknowledgement that she could no longer manage alone, that the household and the family's fragile sense of security now depended on someone she had once dismissed. I accepted the moment with calm, knowing that influence built on patience and humility is far more enduring than that demanded through fear or status. As I walked through the house that night, observing the subtle but undeniable changes, the way my father-in-law considered my counsel, the way my mother-in-law deferred, even quietly, to my insight, I realized that the balance of power had shifted entirely, though quietly, invisibly, and irrevocably, and I knew deep in my heart that the approaching meeting would reveal the full measure of the trust and respect I had earned, while also testing whether this family, once so proud, could fully embrace the change that life had quietly forced upon them. The morning of the critical meeting arrived with a tension that seemed to press against every wall of the house, and I could feel the weight of expectation and fear in the quiet movements of its occupants, in the hesitant glances exchanged, and in the carefully measured words that floated through the air. My mother-in-law, usually so composed and commanding, moved with a subtle nervousness, though I noticed how she now sought my guidance on minor details, from the organization of documents to the wording of responses, and I understood the unspoken truth: she could no longer carry the household's burdens alone. My father-in-law, his pride tempered by necessity, glanced toward me for reassurance more than once, quietly acknowledging that the steadiness I had offered over these past weeks had become an indispensable part of their strategy for navigating the looming crisis. My husband walked beside me as we prepared for the meeting, his hand brushing mine in silent support, reminding me that partnership and trust often speak louder than instructions or authority. I moved through the house performing small acts of care and preparation, not seeking recognition, but aware that each gesture, the arranging of papers, the careful planning, the subtle organization of their priorities, was now valued and necessary. When the meeting finally began, I observed the subtle shifts in demeanor, the ways my parents-in-law deferred quietly to my input, and I realized that the trust and respect I had quietly cultivated had reached its critical moment. This was where patience, humility, and composure would be tested under the sharpest scrutiny, and where my influence could make a tangible difference in outcomes that once seemed beyond my reach. And as the hours unfolded, I could sense that the family's reliance on me, built quietly over weeks of careful observation and subtle guidance, was now fully recognized, even if silently, and that the events of this day would define the new balance in the household. The storm of their crisis was at its peak, and in the calm I carried, they had no choice but to trust me, whether they admitted it or not. The storm of the business crisis finally began to settle, leaving the household in a quiet aftermath that was both sobering and revealing. And I moved through it with a sense of calm that I had cultivated over a lifetime of challenges and patience. My mother-in-law, whose pride had once made her unapproachable, now offered subtle gestures of acknowledgement, hesitant smiles, quiet nods, and moments where she allowed me space to guide decisions that affected the family's future. A silent recognition of the steadiness and wisdom I had brought into a house that had once dismissed me. My father-in-law, whose rigid pride had always been his shield, showed a softened respect, consulting me with sincerity and accepting my input as invaluable in ways he had never imagined possible. And I understood that trust and influence often grow in silence, nurtured by consistency rather than authority. My husband, ever beside me, shared a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the patience, humility, and quiet strength we had carried together had not only steadied the family, but also subtly shifted the dynamics of respect, love, and acknowledgement in ways that would endure beyond the crisis. I reflected on the irony that the very people who had once judged me for my humble beginnings now relied on the qualities honed by that life of hardship: the calm, the understanding, the resilience. And it reminded me that true worth is never measured by wealth, status, or outward appearances, but by the steadiness and compassion one carries into moments of uncertainty. As I moved through the rooms, observing the subtle but profound shifts in behavior, I felt a quiet sense of fulfillment, not of triumph over others, but of having contributed to a change that was necessary, gentle, and lasting. And to you, who have watched this story unfold, I want to leave you with this final thought. Life often surprises us, and the value we bring to the world is not always immediately recognized. But patience, humility, and quiet strength can change hearts and lives in ways we may never fully see. If you watched till the end, like, share, and subscribe so you can get more stories like this. And remember that respect and trust are earned quietly, yet their impact can be immeasurable.